People often ask when the next step in evolution, the step to something beyond man, will happen. But on the Christian view, it has happened already. This is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I'm going to read through some good nuggets of this. Part 1 is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. That's book 1. I'll go through some of that. The law of human nature. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. They say things like this: how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard or behavior which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." Nearly always, he tries to make out that what he has been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there is some special excuse. He pretends there is some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first should not keep it, or that things were quite different when he was given the bit of orange, or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. It looks in fact very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality, or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. And they have, if they had not, they might, of course, fight like animals, but they could not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong. And there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Just as there would be no sense in saying that a footballer had committed a foul unless there was some agreement about the rules of football. So he goes on to say this law or rule about right and wrong used to be called the law of nature. He says, I know that some people say the idea of a law of nature or decent behavior known to all men is unsound because different civilizations and different ages have had quite different moralities. But this is not true. He says, think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. He explains that there might be differences in the moral teachings of people, but there are some things that are agreed among all humans. And he doesn't nail down exactly what that is here, but he just says you have to admit there's something that we all agree on. Some things we all agree on. At the end of this chapter, he says, these are the 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not, in fact, behave in that way. They know the law of nature, they break it. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. Then it goes on to chapter 2. It says, some objections. Feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help, whether you want to or not. He says that we don't just have instincts, there's also this thing that judges between two instincts. All we mean is that the occasions on which the fighting instinct or the sexual desire need to be restrained are rather more frequent than those for restraining motherly love or patriotism. But there are situations in which it is the duty of a married man to encourage his sexual impulse and of a soldier to encourage the fighting instinct. There are also occasions on which a mother's love for her own children or a man's love for his own country have to be suppressed, or they will lead to unfairness towards other people's children or countries. Strictly speaking, there are no such things as good and bad impulses. Think once again of a piano. It has not got two kinds of notes on it, the right notes and the wrong notes. Every single note is right at one time and wrong at another. The moral law is not any one instinct or any set of instincts. It is something which makes a kind of tune, the tune we call goodness or right conduct, by directing the instincts. Then he goes to the objection that moral law is just a social convention. He says there's mere conventions, and then there's mathematics. Stuff like mathematics, they're real truths. The question is to which class the law of human nature belongs, mere conventions or real truths. And to talk about that, he talks about progress. Progress means not just changing, but changing for the better. If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality or Christian morality to Nazi morality. In fact, of course, we all do believe that some moralities are better than others. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understood morality better than their neighbors did. Very well then. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are, in fact, measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality. And he talks about the reason why your idea of New York can be truer or less true than mine is that New York is a real place, existing quite apart from what either of us thinks. If when each of us said New York, each meant merely the town I'm imagining in my own head, how could one of us have truer ideas than the other? There would be no question of truth or falsehood at all. In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nation had ever been more correct in its approval than any other. No sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse. He says, surely the reason we do not execute witches is that we do not believe that there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return, and were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather, surely we would all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. I thought that was funny. There is no difference of moral principle here. He's talking about witches. The difference is simply about matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches. There is no moral advance in not executing them when you do not think they are there. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mousetraps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. Now he goes on to the reality of the law. Chapter 3. If you take a thing like a stone or a tree, it is what it is, and there seems no sense in saying it ought to have been otherwise. Of course, you may say a stone is the wrong shape if you want to use it for a rockery, or that a tree is a bad tree because it does not give you as much shade as you expected. But all you mean is that the stone or tree does not happen to be convenient for some purpose of your own. You are not, except as a joke, blaming them for that. You really know that given the weather and the soil, the tree could not have been any different. What we, from our point of view, call a bad tree is obeying the laws of its nature just as much as a good one. When you say that falling stones always obey the law of gravitation, is not this much the same as saying that the law only means what stones always do? You do not really think that when a stone is let go, it suddenly remembers that it is under orders to fall to the ground. You only mean that in fact it does fall. In other words, you cannot be sure that there is anything over and above the facts themselves. Any law about what ought to happen as distinct from what does happen. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what humans ought to do and do not. In other words, when you are dealing with humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts. So you cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. He says, for instance, we might try to make out that when you say a man ought not to act as he does, you only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape, namely that what he is doing happens to be inconvenient to you. But that is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in the train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man and do not blame the first. I am not angry, except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses, with a man who trips me up by accident. I am angry with a man who tries to trip me up, even if he does not succeed. Yet the first has hurt me and the second has not. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful. But though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. So you cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. Why ought I to be unselfish? Because it is good for society. We may then ask, why should I care what's good for society except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you'll have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. You are saying what is true, but you are not getting any further. If a man asked what was the point of playing football, it would not be much good saying in order to score goals. For trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game. And you would really only be saying that football was football, which is true, but not worth saying. In the same way, if a man asks what is the point of behaving decently, it is no good replying in order to benefit society. For trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, for society after all only means other people, is one of the things decent behavior consists in. All you are really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You would have said as much if you had stopped at the statement, men ought to be unselfish. At the end of this chapter, he says, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. This is chapter 4, what lies behind the law. Let's sum up what we have reached so far. In the case of stones and trees and things of that sort, what we call the laws of nature may not be anything except a way of speaking. When you say that nature is governed by certain laws, this may only mean that nature does in fact behave in a certain way, The so-called laws may not be anything real, anything above and beyond the actual facts which we observe. But in the case of man, we saw that this will not do. The law of human nature, or right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behavior. In this case, besides the actual facts, you have something else, a real law which we did not invent and which we know we ought to obey. He goes on talking about evolution a little bit. He says, by a very long series of chances, the living creatures developed into things like us. That's one view. The other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it's conscious and has purposes and prefers one thing to another. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. If there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men or else make itself known in some different way. The statement that there is any such thing and the statement that there is no such thing are neither of them statements that science can make, and real scientists do not usually make them. There is one thing and only one in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. That one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. If there were anything above or behind the observed facts in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from outside, could never hope to discover it. No mere observation of the facts can find it. He's talking about this thing behind everything, something behind. If there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. No more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or staircase or fireplace in the house. The only way in which we could expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. Talking about a house and the architect who designed the house. It says, suppose someone asked me, I like this part. Suppose someone asked me when I see a man in a blue uniform going down the street, leaving little paper packets at each house, why I suppose that they contain letters. I should reply, because whenever he leaves a similar little packet for me, I find it does contain a letter. And if he then objected, but you've never seen all of those letters which you think the other people are getting, I should say, of course not, and I shouldn't expect to because they're not addressed to me. I'm explaining the packets I'm not allowed to open by the ones I am allowed to open. It is the same about this question. The only packet I am allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. I do not think, of course, that if I could get inside a stone or a tree, I should find exactly the same thing, just as I do not think all the other people in the street get the same letters as I do. I should expect, for instance, to find that the stone had to obey the law of gravity, that whereas the sender of the letters merely tells me to obey the law of my human nature. He compels the stone to obey the laws of its stony nature, but I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of letters in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. This is the last chapter in this part, It's called We Have Cause to Be Uneasy. I ended my last chapter with the idea that in the moral law, somebody or something from beyond the material universe was actually getting at us. And I expected when I reached that point, some of you felt a certain annoyance. You may have thought that I had played a trick on you, that I had been carefully wrapping up to look like philosophy what turns out to be one more religious jaw. You may have felt you were ready to listen to me as long as you thought I had anything new to say. But if it turns out to be only religion, well, the world has tried that and you cannot put the clock back. If anyone is feeling that way, I should like to say 3 things to him. He says, first, would you think I was joking if I said that you can put a clock back, and that if the clock is wrong, it is often a very sensible thing to do? And he uses an allegory here. He says, if you are on the wrong road, he uses an example here. If you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn, a U-turn, and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. Going back is the quickest way on. Then he goes on, secondly, this has not yet turned exactly into a religious jaw. We have not yet got as far as the God of any actual religion, still less the God of that particular religion called Christianity. We have only got as far as a somebody or something behind the moral law. We are not taking anything from the Bible or the churches. We are trying to see what we can find out about this somebody on our own steam. You find out more about a man by listening to his conversations than by looking at a house he has built. Now, from this second bit of evidence, we can conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, and truthfulness. In that sense, we should agree with the account given by Christianity and some other religions that God is good. But do not let us go too fast here. The moral law does not give us any grounds for thinking that God is good in the sense of being indulgent or soft or sympathetic. There is nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is as hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. It is no use at this stage saying that what you mean by a good God is a God who can forgive. You are going too quickly. Only a person can forgive, and we have not yet got as far as a personal God, only as far as a power behind the moral law, and more like a mind than it is like anything else. But it may still be very unlike a person. If it is pure impersonal mind, there may be no sense in asking it to make allowances for you or to let you off, just as there's no sense in asking the multiplication table to let you off when you do your sums wrong. Further down it says, if the universe is not governed by an absolute goodness, then all our efforts are in the long run hopeless. But if it is, then we are making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day. We cannot do without it, and we cannot do with it. Some people talk as if meeting the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. They need to think again. They are still only playing with religion. Goodness is either the great safety or the great danger, according to the way you react to it. And we have reacted the wrong way. He says there is a real moral law and a power behind the law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power. It is, after all this, and not a moment sooner, that Christianity begins to talk. When you know you are sick, you will listen to the doctor. When you have realized that our position is nearly desperate, you will begin to understand what the Christians are talking about. They offer an explanation of how we got into our present state of both hating goodness and loving it. They offer an explanation of how God can be this impersonal mind at the back of the moral law, and yet also a person. They tell you how the demands of this law, which you and I cannot meet, have been met on our behalf, how God himself becomes a man to save man from the disapproval of God. It is an old story, and if you want to go into it, you will no doubt consult people who have more authority to talk about it than I have. All I am doing is to ask people to face the facts, to understand the questions which Christianity claims to answer. This is the end of book 1 here. It says, if you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth. Only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. Most of us have got over the pre-war wishful thinking about international politics. It is time we did the same about religion. So that's some good stuff from Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, book 1. I'll be going through book 2 soon, so like and subscribe and come along the journey with me.